So I'm going to talk now about the self and the ego. So two different terms which I separate for a particular reason. They're often, perhaps I shouldn't say confused, but conflated anyway. That people often think of the two in the same way, or they make a variety of different kinds of distinction between them. So the whole meaning of the terms self and ego, well, let's say that there's a variety of different usages, some of them quite vague, of these two words. So I'm just going to stipulate two senses of them, which I hope will avoid confusion. I just suggest, if you, obviously, there's nothing absolutely correct about a stipulation, it's just the way I choose to use it, but I think there's a reason for doing it in that way. And I'd suggest that, well, the main point of this is the distinction, rather than, you might swap them around if you wanted to, but it's the distinction that I'm trying to make through this. So I'd suggest that the self is what is an idea of what we ultimately are. So what people think of perhaps as the real me, the essential me, so it's a concept of a real or essential me. It's reflected in ideas like the true self, or the soul, or the Atma in Hinduism, or whatever. And so the self is an object of belief. So that means that we have conceptual beliefs about it, which we're holding in our left hemispheres. We've got that kind of belief which tends to be separate from our actual experience of ourselves. So, of course, we can interpret our actual experience of ourselves using that belief, but I don't think we can actually justify that belief through our experience. Now, the other term that I want to distinguish from this is ego. So, I use the term ego to refer really to our identifications, or what we think of as, or experience as, me or mine. So the ego is much more, rather than a belief, it's a meaning or an experience of identification. So by identification, I mean identification with something, feeling it to be me or mine. So obviously, for example, my arm is, I identify with my arm. I'd be very upset if somebody hacks it off for no good reason. Similarly, though, I identify with my house. I identify with my pen even. I identify possibly with, my group of some kind, or even my nation, or whatever. Yeah. So the ego is a flexible thing that can be projected onto all sorts of experiences, but it's the experience of wherever me or mine can be applied. It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to things connected with our own bodies as we normally see them. They're also connected to groups and objects where we experience them in that way. It's that aspect of our experience. So I'm trying to separate it, as yesterday, separate a meaning from a belief. That the ego is something we experience as meaning. The self is something people tend to have beliefs about. Now, one kind of traditional concern of religions and philosophies, particularly, Plato and Descartes bring to mind as major philosophers who are concerned with the self and the question of whether the self exists and what it is, essentially. And then there's a whole Buddhist debate about the self. But that's basically a metaphysical discussion in which I've no desire to participate or try to have a position on. So the thing about the self is that when we consider our experience, and this is kind of an old Buddhist argument really, if we consider our experience, what we experience is a lot of things we identify with. So there's a thought, there's a feeling, there's a concept of one kind or another. But when we attach me or mine to any of those things, we're just assuming that they're me or mine. We may experience them as me or mine, but we have no way of being sure that they are absolutely, in fact, in reality, in ultimate reality, me or mine. So the self may or may not exist. So I'm suggesting what we need towards the self is hard agnosticism, towards the whole question of whether the self exists or not.
Could you just quickly clarify the difference between soft agnosticism and hard agnosticism?
Yeah. Agnosticism is recognising that you don't know. The soft version of that is where you might expect to know in the future, where you think there's a possibility you might find out. Hard agnosticism, I think, is just recognising that uncertainty is the basis of our experience. Being embodied beings, we're never going to gain certainty as long as we're embodied beings. So it's a very similar picture, I think, to the one with God. So we know knowing whether God exists or not, similarly towards the self. There are cruder expositions of Buddhism which see Buddhism as having the belief that there is no self, but if you present it in that way, I think that's equally misleading to saying that there is a self. There are more sophisticated versions or explanations of Buddhism which do get as far as saying there is neither a self nor not a self. We just don't know. So I think the implications of that are hard agnostic, which requires us really to try and avoid getting sucked into the argument, to try and change the basis of the discussion about the self. So, obviously, as with most of these topics, there's a negative and a positive side to it, so we can look at the negative effects of having strong beliefs either for or against the self, but we can, as with other metaphysical beliefs, but more positively, we can think about the ego and the experience of the ego and how we work with it, and that's obviously an important part of practice. So I'll try and be relatively brief about the problems with the self, again, to avoid getting too sucked into the philosophy, but let me just briefly talk about the drawbacks. So, one obvious example which may spring to mind is the immortal soul in Christianity. So, the belief in an essential self tends to get associated with a whole host of other metaphysical beliefs, such as belief in an afterlife, so a belief that you continue to exist after death in some form. And that in itself I've always found rather strange, because it's very difficult to kind of explain in what sense in the afterlife I would be the same person. And in order for it to be a just outcome, I've got to be absolutely the same person. And our experience completely goes against that, because we're always changing. So there seems to be a major contradiction in the whole idea of an afterlife in which I get some kind of justice, whether that's justice doled out by God or just following the law of karma or whatever. So there's the immortal soul, and similarly beliefs about rebirth or reincarnation. There's also the self appears in the sort of myth of the neutral observer, So the idea that we can have a standpoint which is absolute and neutral. So we've got the soul and we've got the idea of the neutral observer, and this can be an issue in science. I mean, scientists can try and allow for this and compensate for it, but there certainly are some scientific observations which appear to not to take into account the fact that the observer themselves is changing. The observer has a limited perspective, so when they're looking at things. I mean, a simple example that springs to mind is the scientific observations of homosexual behaviour in animals. That scientists used to observe. They didn't recognise that that's what it was, or they didn't give it that label. They thought, well, animals can't be homosexual. That's a human perversity. So it must be sort of youthful bonding behaviour or something of that kind. But of course, maybe it isn't homosexual behaviour. There's still a possibility being wrong about that as well. We can become aware of previous mistakes we've made through assuming that we had a neutral standpoint when we didn't.
The science of kind of the neutral observer is a kind of repeatability of things where different observers are observing the same thing.
Indeed.
That then gives you a neutrality to the observation.
Well, that's a way of trying to give more or become more objective. Yes, I'll come to that in a bit later. Well, after the break, later on actually, this morning. And then there's also the idea of the kind of neutral or predictable consumer used in economics. So what's sometimes known as Homo economicus, who predictably serves their self-interest. And again, that just seems to be a construction, an idea that that's what selves are, rather than something based on more varied experience we have. But that's. I don't want to go into great detail about the self. I want to concentrate more on the ego really here. So, the ego. If we think about the ego as an experience really of wishing and of wanting and desiring. So the ego is we could say, a collection of wishes, desires, and identifications. I mentioned that term earlier. So instead of saying, as Descartes did, I think therefore I exist, perhaps we could say, insofar as we experience ourselves, we want, therefore we exist. That's the sort of direct experience we have insofar as we have one. But obviously I wouldn't draw the same kind of conclusions from that Descartes did. That's why I'm suggesting that the ego is where we need to start when it comes to value. We're not going to experience any other kind of value than the one the ego offers us. The ego gives us a set of desires which drive us, which urge us on to do certain things, to fulfil certain plans, to reach certain goals in our lives. Whether they're little things like having a cup of coffee to major things like career goals or whatever. At one and the same time, though, those desires are not the last word, so we shouldn't assume that the desires we have at any one moment are the best ones we can have, or the most valuable, or the final word in ethical judgment at a particular time. So the ego, by itself, as we've been seeing earlier, can be deluded. In fact, most of the time it is. It's subject to many cognitive biases and limitations. Nevertheless, it's the seat of our values. So that basically, the more we can integrate that ego, the more we can integrate those left brain representations at one particular point, bring them together with other ones at other points, the more those values can become integrated with other values, and in the process, the more conditions we can take into account. And therefore, I think that's the key of the whole question of values. So, I'd contrast that with perhaps a more traditional view that people tend to take of the ego, which is the idea that the ego is bad, and that we ought to, in some way, exterminate the ego or get rid of the ego. But that's it's just like sitting on a tree branch and sawing it off while you're sitting on it. That's all our everything we value is egoistic in that sense. So rather than trying to exterminate the ego, we need to integrate it. Rather than saying it's bad, we need to say, well, it's not as good as it might be. There's an incremental process that we can go through to integrate the ego, which builds on what we have already positively, rather than trying to remove the ego. So I make no distinction between desires and values, which is something that outrages quite a few philosophers in my experience. And the problem with other ideas about value is that they tend to be metaphysical, they tend to be based on beliefs which really aren't ultimately based on experiences. So if you try and derive your values from, for example, the enlightened perceptions of the Buddha as you understand them, or from God, or from some rational principle, you still end up with something which is beyond experience. If you're not experiencing it as valuable, then you're not necessarily going to be in a position to build on that and integrate that value.
So would you say value could be interpreted as something that you want, as in something you hold dear?
Yeah, it's something you want, but it's value in terms of whether it's a justified value or an objective value is an incremental matter. So it could become, it's a value which can always become more objective or better from an ethical point of view. But that doesn't mean it's bad to start with. It's just limited or constrained in some ways to start with. Just as our momentary current left hemisphere views are limited.
But other people, you can appreciate other people may have values which you yourself don't have. Even if it's not your desires, you can appreciate that a value exists out there which is independent of your wishes.
But values exist in other people, and those values, as other people present them to me, also come into my experience. So there's an integration process which you could see either psychologically or socially.
And their values are their desires, so that's,
so their values are their desires, yes. So I can work on integrating those either within terms of my own understanding of their values, or if we think of it more socially or politically, in terms of the negotiated basis on which society works, the values on which groups make decisions or society makes decisions. So the integration of the ego is also a basis of peace in society and the world, if we think in terms of the relationships between people. So you might think of the ego as being like a set of pieces separated through time that we might want to, we're trying to assemble perhaps into a larger whole. But we couldn't assemble the larger whole if we didn't have the pieces in the first place. But obviously, in order to be able to go through that process of integrating egoistic desires, we need to work with beliefs. So we're going to have beliefs about desires and beliefs about values. And I tend to think of these as moral beliefs. In some ways, they're beliefs about how we should act. That should may be a very immediate, practical sort of should, what philosophers call a prudential should. So it might be I should brush my teeth in order to keep prevent tooth decay, or it might be I should eat a sandwich in order to assuage my hunger, or it might be I should work towards or contribute towards the campaigns to get a better political response to global warming. It could be a much bigger should than that. So we have these beliefs about desires or values, and those beliefs obviously cannot be absolute. If we're going to base them on experience and make them compatible with experience, we can't give them an absolute form. So they always need to be provisional. So hence the key role of provisionality in the middle way.
Should you not call them something other than beliefs then? Could you have a different word for them?
What, when they're provisional?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I mean...
Do you know what I mean? Because you're confusing things like self-big S and the small s, and you've got beliefs which seem to be something which we don't consider as kosher, and provisional beliefs which are okay.
Well, it's not that I've got anything against beliefs.
But they're of different nature, whatever, they're different things.
Well, it's not. It's an incremental distinction. Yeah. So beliefs can be
beliefs,
more or less justified. Yeah.
Yeah, but beliefs aren't incremental, are they?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
They can be. Yeah. So
I thought meaning was kind of. I thought belief was this kind of left-brain thing that was metaphysical, or
not necessarily. No. So that's something we need to think about more and clarify. But the beliefs can be everyday beliefs, like I believe there's a book on the table over there. Yeah. And that's a provisional belief in the sense that I could have further experiences which lead me to revise that belief. Yeah. So belief is simply some sort of affirmation or commitment for the moment, so that I act as though something is the case in my experience. So not all beliefs are metaphysical by any means.
Oh, okay. So metaphysical beliefs, and you've got provisional beliefs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So this is the crucial thing where the middle way is concerned. That we have the middle way with provisional beliefs in the middle, in this uncertain, tricky middle place. But on either side, we've got pressing in or pressing out. We've got absolute beliefs or metaphysical beliefs, which could be positive in that they're asserting something, or they could be similarly negative on the other side.
But my point is that then when you're talking, you should say, I provisionally believe there's a book on the table, because lots of people, when they say, I believe there's a book on the table, they mean, I absolutely believe there's a book on the table. And when you say believe, you don't know, well, hang on, which belief are we talking about?
Well, if you want to be really clear, then yes, I'd agree. That's maybe what we should do, but whether we can do that practically all the time will be another question.
But one thing you can do in regard to this is couch the way you speak in provisional terms. So the evidence appears to suggest that, or you use the term justification a lot, which is a lot easier way of expressing belief.
But it's just when you're listening to someone else saying something, you don't know, well, do you mean provisional or do you mean absolutely?
Indeed, and that's actually already been an issue on this retreat. So, there's a lot dependent on the context of interpreting what people actually say, obviously, and to do with knowing their characters and how provisionally they generally mean things and so on. There's no easy way around that, I don't think, except working with it and trying to be reasonably precise. But obviously, you can't go overboard in everyday conversation.
No, but it helps, and you're trying to be accurate, doesn't it? It's like when Peter, said his son pulled someone up and saying, "Women do such and such." He said, "Some women do something."
Yeah,
it's kind
that can help. Yeah. I mean, I tend to thought maybe I rely on this too much, but I tend to say I think such and such as an indicator of provisionality, rather than it's the case that my view is such and such.
Or it can be argued.
Yeah. Because even there's a lady with that picture of Adam and Eve, and she said, "Oh well, I think this shows men's domination over women." And Whereas if she'd said this shows some men's domination over women, it would be more provisional rather than absolute, and I would have felt more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But I didn't like to raise it as saying, you know,
Yeah.
I think it's a very useful skill to cultivate, talking in more provisional terms.
Because it actually makes you feel more provisional as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a close relationship. I think the ego itself is a provisional thing, isn't it? That we've got these desires at the moment, and we just recognise and we act on those desires. We haven't got any other desires to act on, but nevertheless, we're recognising, if we're being provisional about it, that those particular desires we have will change and may change. This links in very much with the observations by Ian McGilchrist about the differences of the two hemispheres in relation to time. That the left hemisphere can only really understand sequence rather than the actual temporality or the passage of time. So if the left hemisphere is time blind, then it needs help from the right to actually put together the beliefs it may have at a particular time with those it may have at another time. So left to itself, or left being too dominant by itself over the right, it may just continue with the assumption that the beliefs it happens to have at the moment are the absolutely correct ones. And it's the connection over time requiring the kind of awareness the right hemisphere can impart, which will help with that integration process. And that integration process is central to making those beliefs provisional, or what it actually means for a belief to be provisional, that we have a wider awareness, at least of the possibility of it being different, there being other things going on at other times. So, our understanding of the ego is central to ethics and to justification of our beliefs. That there are things we desire and believe at the moment, but there's also a whole set of other things we might potentially desire or believe, and it's really the interplay between those, that the actual beliefs at the moment and the potential ones, that creates the dynamic for ethics. I think that we're challenged on the one hand by how things might be, but at the same time we recognise how things are at the moment. So the challenge of ethics is to move things on a little bit realistically from where we are at the moment to where we might be. Mm-hmm. So if we can hold both of these things in awareness, how things are at the moment and how they might be, that's an ethics, a sort of dialectical ethics which occurs in experience, rather than just, I ought to be following this big metaphysical rule which has come from somewhere else. And so perhaps before I close this particular talk, I just want to say a little bit about cognitive biases that relate to the self and the idea of the self. Perhaps I'll just keep it for a few. So there's what's known as the self-serving bias. So if we're going to serve ourselves, as it were, if we're going to support ourselves as we see ourselves, we have to have a view of ourselves as a kind of fixed entity. And where this occurs as a cognitive bias is where we interpret ambiguous information in a way which is favourable to ourselves. One classic version of this is where we take credit for success, even when it's pretty ambiguous how that success came about, but we blame others for failures. So with success, perhaps even if you were kind of leading a group that was successful, the other team members also contributed, and the surrounding conditions also helped out to make you successful. But our tendency, again, according to what psychologists have discovered fairly consistently in people is that we tend to err on the side of interpreting this ambiguous information in accordance with this view of ourselves that we've assembled in our interests.
And this is an ego-serving bias. This is metaphysical self-serving bias.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you could say it's ego-serving in the sense of a narrow interpretation of the ego at a particular time. But that's how you could describe it in terms of experience. But in terms of the beliefs that we have, there's a belief in the self behind it. I mean, another one is straightforward envy, good old-fashioned vice. So if you want what someone else has got, you want to incorporate it into yourself, which requires a kind of fixed idea of what yourself is, and obviously that involves also reaction against others and your idea of the other. Or social comparison bias. So comparing ourselves constantly to others as the basis of judgment. I mean, there was a particularly important example of this in the news and a matter of controversy in the media a year or two ago, when there's a lot of discussion about bankers and their bonuses and their pay levels. And but when you talk to bankers, or you hear bankers talking about this, the basis on which they judge the pay they ought to have is nearly always comparison with other bankers, or possibly other people for whom there's similar demand in the economy. Mm-hmm. So we tend to have an idea of ourselves as being in a particular limited sphere. So in this case it will be, I'm a banker. Bankers are rightfully, justifiably entitled to this kind of level of pay. So therefore I should have it. But obviously we can do this in all kinds of other ways that we might feel just because someone else who's like us has a certain thing, or deserves a certain thing, so do we, or and it can also work negatively. Okay, and just another interesting one is the Forer effect. This comes into astrology, for example. When you read an ambiguous horoscope, which tells you, well, in my case, it's because I'm a Cancer, all these various things are going to happen to me during the next week. But, I mean, these things are usually broad enough that they could more or less happen to anybody. But the amazing thing is that a large number of people are taken in by these things. I mean, perhaps not that many people take horoscopes seriously, but there are other things like this, like the same sort of effect can happen with character typology. Perhaps if you're not careful with it, a sort of confirmation bias. Oh, that's me, because it fits an idea of me that I have already as a self-view. So we interpret that ambiguous evidence again in terms of that construction. That's physical belief. Okay, I mean, there are a whole lot of other possible cognitive biases I could discuss here, but perhaps I'll get on to some others in relation to responsibility. So I'll talk about responsibility another time, which connects a lot with this. But just to close with some practical points, because I would want to try this into, well, what can we do with this practically? I think that the major thing I'm going to suggest is avoiding self-based judgments about ethics. So if we try and think of ethics not in terms of selflessness or selfishness or avoiding selfishness, this is very, very common, conventional way of thinking about ethics. People use these words constantly. that was selfish, with the immediate implication that's bad. But as far as I can see, what it has to do with the self has no connection with moral justification or otherwise. So you can be doing something which supports you as an individual, or is good for you as an individual, or follows your desires as an individual, and it may be the best and most objective way of judging and acting at that moment.
But it's not the motivation which is important rather than the outcome as such. And if you're doing something selfishly, even if it has a positive outcome, it's still immoral.
Well, it's that depends on whether you want to use a metaphysical idea of the self as the basis of judgment as to what's immoral, or whether you want to start with the experience of value.
Okay.
So that's what I think people tend to do here, perhaps very unconsciously. If they really are basing their judgments on this, and maybe they're not, maybe they're just using the words, but if they really are basing their judgments about ethics on selfishness and selflessness, it's usually roughly based on an idea of individual interests, and that the idea that serving individual interests as opposed to others' interests is bad, and serving others' interests as opposed to individuals is good. And I can't see what that has to do with ethics at all, because ethics is as I understand it, is about integration. Is about the integration of values. The integration of those values has to work realistically with the conditions we start with, the conditions we experience at the moment, in tension with how they might become more integrated, rather than setting ourselves an abstracted belief of how we might immediately give up our self-identification and serve others, or if you're reversing that, how we might serve ourselves, which could be obviously just as limited. So although there are sometimes narrow left brain dominant kinds of views, may often be obsessed with an idea of the individual and the interests of the individual. They're not always. You can have pretty narrow views which are about saving the world, or about serving God, or about serving others. You can have very narrow forms of selflessness, unintegrated forms of selflessness. So I think on the whole it's much better if we try and drop this kind of way of thinking about ethics. I appreciate that it's difficult because it's so widespread, but really seems very unhelpful to me. So that also means, more positively, that we build on our experience of ego identification. So we have a sense of who we are and what we value, which I think is the root of our confidence in what we believe in and what we're doing. If we try and jump to some other basis of judgment, we're very likely to be deluding ourselves, because we'll be, being embodied beings, we're not going to experience some other person's or some absolutely abstracted sorts of identification or desires. We've got to start with our desires. So we can only work with that if we've got a sort of positive sense of that to begin with. That a confidence which actually allows us to then potentially be self-critical if we need to be, to recognise the limitations of our beliefs, but we won't be able, we probably won't have in some cases, the self-esteem to engage in that if we don't have this basic confidence in our ego identification in the first place.
So could you give us an example of that, building positively on experience of ego?
Almost any any kind of decision might involve this, but let's take the judgment about going on retreat. That presumably everybody here has had some sense that it might be a good thing, might be a valuable thing to go on retreat. That it might be a good thing, well, either in terms of our own development or in terms of our understanding and the further effects that might have on our lives and so on, to go on retreat. So, God, obviously this connects with the first point that if other people see that as they sometimes do, as a selfish thing to do, because you're always sort of going on retreat in order to concentrate on your own states more, relatively speaking, for a restricted period of time, yeah, that's I don't think there's insufficient justification from that criticism just because it's based on a dogmatic, or appears to be based on a dogmatic view of what we're doing. So I think we need to have confidence in those judgments we make, which are based on our fallible, ego identifications. They're always going to be, unavoidably. But that's the basis of the confidence we can have.
But that's as if to say, just because you want something, you should think, well, it's justified to do it.
No, I'm not saying that.
Is it?
No.
Is that way? Because ego identification, that's you're identifying with what you want. The ego comes in your desires. Therefore, if you desire something and you identify with that, you could easily end up feeling justified in doing it.
Indeed.
Well, even if it's wrong. Even if
Oh, even if it's wrong, yeah. But how are you actually going to recognise that it's wrong? I think that's the key thing.
Yeah.
You're only going to recognise that it's wrong.
But you're not suggesting that. You're saying just have confidence and self-confidence that your desires are justifiable.
Well, I think that's got to be the starting point for any justification we reach, which works within experience. So it's only by having that confidence in the first place that we can start to engage with the possibility of being wrong and the possibility of adjusting those desires we have. I mean, if we, well, let's consider the alternative. Supposing someone else criticises you, saying you're really selfish going on retreat. You should be spending that week, doing voluntary work in your community or something like this. And consider, well, how would I feel? Not just would it be a good idea in the abstract, but how would I feel about doing voluntary work in the community in response to this person's criticism, as it were, obeying their beliefs. Now, obviously, if you really want to do that, then you might change your mind. But if you simply repress the desire you had to do something you judged to be right in the first place, you sit on it and say, okay, I'll do this other thing, which particularly if it's an authority figure who tells you to do it, that's not going to solve the problem. You're going to end up with a conflict, which in the longer term will probably affect how well you do the voluntary work you're doing instead, which will disrupt the overall integration with which you're engaging in what you're doing. So it might well sabotage the good effects of the voluntary work, for that matter.
So we end up just doing what we want to do, basically.
Doing what we want to do, but working to integrate what we want to do. What we want to do is not just a given. I think that's the big mistake that people make. They think
so other people may want us to do something else, and you have to take that into account.
Yeah. Exactly. That's part of the integration process, that we recognise they may be telling us something important and work with that in our...
And how do we make a judgment as to which one to do?
That's a big question, which I'd rather leave to after the break, when I will be talking about it.
We'll come back.
Yeah.